My wife wanted an open marriage so she could pursue her boss while keeping me as backup. She thought she was so clever giving me permission to date knowing I'd probably strike out. But life loves a good plot twist. While she's stuck with a guy who won't even hold her hand in public, I found someone who can't wait to introduce me to her family. Her scheme backfired spectacularly and now I'm the happy one. Stay tuned to find out how her so-called manager romance blows up in her face. But let me start from the beginning because this story gets wild fast. What seemed like a solid marriage turned into the most obvious setup in relationship history. The setup when your wife suddenly discovers self-improvement. For 8 years, I thought my marriage was rock solid. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet Sunday mornings where she'd steal half my coffee and I'd pretend to be annoyed. She was this homebody who preferred Netflix marathons to going out, who got anxious in large groups. I love that about her, actually. There was something comforting about being with someone who was perfectly content with our little bubble. Then she started this new job, and everything changed overnight. At first, I was genuinely excited for her. She'd been stuck in a boring office for years where nobody appreciated her ideas and her boss treated her like furniture. This new position came with better pay, cooler colleagues, and actual growth opportunities. When she told me about struggling to fit in with her new team, I encouraged her to put herself out there. Make friends, go to happy hour, be social. I figured it would boost her confidence and maybe she'd finally see herself the way I saw her. What I didn't expect was for her to transform into someone I barely recognized. Within weeks, my wife became this party animal who was out 3 nights a week doing team-building exercises that apparently required extensive amounts of alcohol. She started coming home at midnight smelling like expensive cocktails and talking about these amazing new friends who were teaching her how to live her best life. These women were mostly single, recently divorced or in complicated relationships, and they seemed to have convinced my wife that she'd been missing out on some grand adventure by being happily married. The bedroom situation became a disaster zone pretty quickly. My wife had never been the type to initiate intimacy, but now she was either too exhausted from her late nights or completely uninterested. When I tried to talk to her about the sudden changes, she'd brush me off and say she was just exploring who she really was. Apparently, who she really was turned out to be someone who had no time for her husband. Then came the manager. At first, it was innocent enough. She'd mentioned how this new guy was so different from previous bosses, how he really understood the team dynamics and made work fun again. But those casual mentions started happening every single day. She'd tell me about how he handled difficult clients with such finesse, how he resolved workplace conflicts beyond mere reports like some kind of corporate therapist, how he had this amazing ability to motivate everyone around him. These weren't work-related observations anymore. She was describing him like he was some kind of Renaissance man who happened to excel at quarterly reports. The warning bells in my head were going off, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just excited about having a boss who wasn't terrible for once. But then came the questions that made everything crystal clear. She started asking if I ever regretted not dating more women before we got together. Did I ever wonder what it would be like to be with someone else? Did I feel like I missed out on experiences by settling down so young? I kept telling her no, that she was everything I wanted and needed, but she'd get this weird look in her eyes like my answer disappointed her somehow. She'd quickly changed the subject, but I could tell these conversations were leading somewhere specific. The way she asked made it obvious she already had someone in mind for her own exploration. Her crush on this manager was becoming more transparent by the day. She started talking about him in contexts that had nothing to do with work. How he handled stress, his philosophy on work-life balance, his thoughts on relationships and personal growth. She knew details about his personal life that seemed way too intimate for a professional relationship. She'd light up when his name came up in conversation, the same way teenagers get excited talking about their favorite celebrity, The woman who used to get embarrassed making eye contact with waiters was practically glowing every time she mentioned this guy. I started paying closer attention to her stories about work events and noticed how they all seemed to revolve around interactions with him. The team building exercises always involved him organizing activities. The late nights were strategy sessions where he was sharing his wisdom about life and career advancement. The group drinks somehow always ended up being deep conversations where he was offering personal advice to everyone. Either this guy was running some kind of workplace therapy practice, or my wife was finding excuses to spend as much time with him as possible. The most ridiculous part was how she thought she was being subtle about the whole thing. She'd casually work his name into completely unrelated conversations. We'd be watching a movie and she'd comment on how the main character handled conflict just like her manager would. We'd be at dinner and she'd mention how he'd recommended this great restaurant across town. She was like a teenager with her first crush, finding ways to bring up her obsession in every conversation while thinking nobody noticed. Meanwhile, she kept dropping hints about feeling like she'd missed out on life experiences by getting married so young. She'd see couples on dating shows and wonder out loud what it would be like to have that excitement of meeting someone new. She'd ask hypothetical questions about whether people could love multiple people at the same time. Every conversation felt like she was testing the waters for something bigger. I could see the wheels turning in her head during these discussions. She was clearly working up to some grand proposal, but trying to make it seem like a natural evolution of our relationship rather than a scheme she'd been cooking up since the day she met this guy. The timing was so obvious it was almost insulting. Within months of meeting this manager, she'd gone from contentedly married homebody to someone questioning the entire foundation of monogamous relationships. Her friends were obviously encouraging this whole transformation. These single and divorced women had convinced her that she was wasting her life being faithful to one person. They were filling her head with stories about all the amazing experiences she was missing out on, all the personal growth that could only come from dating multiple people, all the adventure waiting for her if she just had the courage to explore. The funniest part was watching her think she was being so clever about the whole setup. She probably practiced these conversations in the mirror, rehearsing how to bring up the topic of relationship flexibility without making it obvious she already had a specific person in mind. She thought she was being this smooth manipulator when really she was as transparent as glass. Could her push for self-improvement lead to real trouble? What happened next would prove just how wrong she was about everything. The pitch, how to cheat without technically cheating. Then came the conversation that changed everything. After weeks of building up to this moment, she finally revealed her master plan. We were sitting on the couch after dinner when she brought up the topic of open marriage like she was suggesting we try a new restaurant. She said she'd been thinking about how we could spice up our relationship and add some excitement to our lives. The timing was perfect, considering she'd spent the last hour telling me about another fascinating conversation she'd had with her manager about life philosophy and personal growth. Her pitch was honestly impressive in its audacity. She explained how we could explore connections with other people while still maintaining our strong foundation together. We'd have the security of our marriage, but also the freedom to experience what we might be missing. She painted this picture of how much stronger our relationship would become once we satisfied our curiosity about other people. It was the ultimate solution that would let her have her cake and eat it too. I sat there stunned because this was coming from the woman who used to get jealous when female cashiers smiled at me too long. The same person who once got upset because I mentioned finding an actress attractive during a movie. She transformed from someone who wanted complete devotion to someone suggesting we share ourselves with strangers. It was like my traditional homebody wife had been replaced by someone who'd been reading too many relationship blogs written by people with commitment issues. The way she presented it made it sound so reasonable and modern. She talked about how some couples were exploring these arrangements and how it could actually strengthen our bond by removing the pressure and expectations that come with monogamy. She said we were mature enough to handle this kind of relationship evolution and that it showed how much we trusted each other. Her argument was so well rehearsed it was obvious she'd been practicing this speech for weeks. The timing of this proposal was about as subtle as a marching band at a funeral. Just days after telling me about another deep, meaningful conversation with her manager, she was suddenly interested in opening our marriage. The woman who'd never shown any interest in relationship experimentation was now advocating for the exact arrangement that would give her permission to pursue the guy she'd been obsessing over for months. She might as well have handed me a written request to approve her affair. She kept emphasizing how this wasn't about anyone specific, but about personal growth and exploration. We were young when we got together, and maybe we'd benefit from understanding what else was out there. She said it would make us appreciate each other more once we realized how good we had it together. The whole presentation felt like she was trying to convince me to invest in something I knew would bankrupt me emotionally. My brain was spinning, trying to process this complete personality change. This was the woman who used to say she couldn't imagine being with anyone else, who would get sentimental about her wedding vows, who said she felt sorry for people who couldn't find their soulmate like she had. Now she was sitting here explaining why limiting ourselves to one person was actually holding us back from reaching our full potential as individuals and as a couple. She addressed my obvious shock by saying she knew this seemed sudden, but she'd been thinking about it for a long time. She wanted to be honest about her feelings rather than let resentment build up over missed opportunities. She said she loved me too much to cheat, but also felt like she was dying inside from wondering what else might be out there. This arrangement would let her explore without betraying our marriage or losing what we'd built together. The manipulation was almost artistic in its execution. She positioned herself as the honest wife who was being transparent about her needs rather than going behind my back. She made it seem like opening the marriage was actually the more ethical choice compared to having an affair. She was basically asking for a hall pass while making it sound like she was doing me a favor by being upfront while wanting to sleep with other people. I found myself caught between my gut instinct that this was completely wrong and not wanting to seem like some controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's personal growth. She'd framed the whole thing in a way that made any objection sound possessive and outdated. If I said no, I'd be the jealous husband holding her back from self-discovery. If I agreed, I'd be the understanding partner who trusted her enough to explore this together. She kept asking what I thought about the idea, and whether I might be interested in exploring connections with other women too. The way she asked made it clear she expected me to be excited about this opportunity. She probably assumed I'd jump at the chance to date other people since most guys would supposedly love that kind of arrangement. She seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't immediately on board with her brilliant plan. The pressure to agree was intense because she presented it as this mature, evolved approach to relationships that only confident couples could handle. Saying no would mean admitting I was too insecure or traditional to embrace this kind of modern relationship structure. She'd already decided this was happening and was just going through the motions of getting my consent to make it seem like a mutual decision. I kept thinking about how our parents and grandparents never had to navigate these kinds of relationship negotiations. They got married and stayed faithful until death do us part without having to consider whether they were missing out on other experiences. Now apparently commitment was seen as limiting rather than meaningful. Somewhere along the way, society decided that exploring multiple relationships was more important than building depth with one person. The whole conversation felt surreal because I knew I was being manipulated, but couldn't find a way to say no without looking like the bad guy. She constructed this perfect scenario where agreeing made me the understanding husband and refusing made me the controlling one. There was no option that let me express how wrong this felt without seeming unreasonable or possessive. After hours of discussion and her patient explanations about why this would ultimately benefit both of us, I finally agreed. I told her we could try it, but with clear rules and honest communication about how we were both feeling. Even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew I was making a huge mistake. I was essentially giving my wife official permission to pursue the relationship she'd already been building with her manager. She was so relieved when I said yes that it confirmed my suspicions about her true motivations. This wasn't about spicing up our marriage or personal growth. This was about getting approval for something she planned to do regardless of my feelings. I just made it easier for her by removing the guilt and secrecy from her upcoming affair. She'd managed to turn cheating into an approved marital activity, and I'd gone along with it because I didn't want to seem like the unreasonable one. What I didn't realize was just how differently this arrangement would play out for each of us. Game on, the tale of two dating experiences. The dating apps went live and immediately revealed just how unprepared we both were for what came next. My wife jumped into this new world like she'd been training for months, while I sat there wondering what the hell I got myself into. She had profiles on 3 different apps within 24 hours and was getting matches faster than I could process what was happening to my life. The speed at which she moved should have been my first clue that this whole arrangement had been planned long before our conversation on the couch. She knew exactly what photos to use, exactly how to write her profile, and exactly what she was looking for. Meanwhile, I stared at a blank dating profile for 3 days trying to figure out how to explain that I was married but available without sounding like either a creep or a guy having a midlife crisis. She went on her first date within a week and came home glowing like she'd just discovered electricity. She told me all about this amazing dinner conversation and how refreshing it was to connect with someone new. The guy was charming and funny and made her feel things she'd forgotten she could feel. She asked if I was okay with everything and seemed genuinely concerned about my feelings right up until I started talking. Then her eyes would glaze over and she'd start checking her phone for messages from her new friend. My first attempt at dating was a disaster that lasted exactly 1 drink. I met this woman at a coffee shop and spent the entire hour feeling like I was cheating on my wife even though I had explicit permission to be there. Every time the conversation turned flirty, I'd panic and redirect to safe topics like the weather or current events. She probably thought I was the most boring person she'd ever met. I went home that night feeling guilty and confused, while my wife was out on her second date of the week. The predictable part was watching her gravitate straight toward her manager like a moth to a flame. She'd mentioned casually that she'd run into him while out with friends or that they grabbed coffee to discuss work projects. These workplace encounters started happening with suspicious frequency. Soon she was telling me about their deep conversations about life goals and personal philosophy. The woman who'd sold me on exploring connections with strangers was spending all her time with the one person she'd been obsessing over for months. My dating app experience was like trying to learn a foreign language while everyone else was having fluent conversations. Women would message me with references to memes I didn't understand or expect me to know the unwritten rules of modern dating etiquette. I'd spend 20 minutes crafting responses that sounded normal only to get one-word replies or complete silence. Apparently, 8 years of marriage had left me completely unprepared for whatever this new dating world had become. She started staying out later and coming home with stories about amazing restaurants and fun bars I'd never heard of. Her social calendar became packed with dates and group hangouts while I was struggling to get through one awkward coffee meeting per week. She'd ask how my dating was going with this tone of voice that suggested she expected me to be having as much fun as she was. When I told her about my struggles, she'd offer helpful advice about being more confident and putting myself out there. The irony was suffocating. The person who'd wanted this arrangement was thriving while I felt like I was drowning in experiences I never asked for. She'd wake up energized and excited about her plans for the evening while I dreaded having to pretend I was enjoying this new lifestyle. She was living her best life while I was questioning everything I thought I knew about love and commitment. Her fake concern for my well-being became more obvious as the weeks went by. She'd check in with me about how I was handling everything, but it felt like going through the motions rather than genuine interest. If I mentioned feeling uncomfortable or confused, she'd remind me that we'd agreed to try this together and that it would take time to adjust. She never offered to slow down or reconsider the arrangement. She just wanted confirmation that I wasn't going to ruin her fun by having feelings about it. Dating apps revealed just how out of practice I was with the whole concept of romantic pursuit. I'd forgotten how to flirt without feeling ridiculous or how to show interest without coming across as desperate. Women my age were either looking for serious relationships that I couldn't offer as a married man or casual hookups that felt wrong given my traditional values. I was stuck in this weird middle ground where I wasn't single enough for the dating world, but wasn't married enough to feel secure in my relationship. She started bringing up her manager more frequently in our conversations about her dating experiences. They'd moved from occasional coffee meetings to regular dinner dates to weekend activities together. She described their chemistry and emotional connection like she was talking about characters in a romantic movie. The woman who'd promised this was about exploring multiple connections was clearly focusing all her energy on one specific person. My attempts at physical intimacy with other women felt like betraying everything I believed about love and commitment. Even when opportunities presented themselves, I'd find excuses to leave early or redirect conversations away from anything too personal. I was participating in an open marriage while still thinking like a monogamous person. The cognitive dissonance was tearing me apart. She'd return from her dates with stories about meaningful conversations and exciting adventures while I came home from mine feeling empty and confused. She was discovering new sides of herself through these connections while I was losing pieces of who I thought I was. The arrangement that was supposed to strengthen our relationship was highlighting just how differently we approached love and loyalty. Her enthusiasm for this lifestyle made it clear that she'd been feeling trapped in our marriage long before she suggested opening it. She was finally getting to be the person she'd always wanted to be while I was being forced to become someone I never wanted to become. The gap between our experiences was growing wider every day, and I was starting to wonder if this whole experiment was going to destroy everything we built together. After months of awkward encounters and failed connections, I was ready to give up on this whole dating thing entirely. But sometimes life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Plot twist: when the underdog finds his match. That surprise came in the form of Sarah. After months of awkward coffee dates and uncomfortable small talk, I finally connected with someone who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person rather than treating our meeting like some kind of social experiment. She was this vibrant woman who had moved here from South America for work and brought this refreshing perspective on life that I hadn't encountered in years. What struck me immediately was how easy conversation felt with her. We talked for hours about everything from travel stories to career goals to family traditions without any of those painful silences that had plagued my other dating attempts. She laughed at my jokes and asked follow-up questions about my interests like she actually cared about the answers. For the first time since this whole open marriage experiment began, I found myself looking forward to spending time with someone instead of dreading another evening of forced interaction. The difference between being with Sarah and being in my marriage became crystal clear within weeks. She would text me during the day just to share something funny that happened or ask how my work presentation went. She remembered details from our previous conversations and brought up topics she knew I was passionate about. When we were together, she gave me her full attention instead of constantly checking her phone or seeming distracted by other thoughts. It was like discovering what genuine interest and affection felt like after years of taking scraps for granted. My wife's reaction to this development was hilarious in its complete miscalculation. When I mentioned that I'd been seeing someone regularly, she smiled and nodded like this was exactly what she'd hoped would happen. She asked basic questions about Sarah, with the same tone she might use to inquire about a new hobby I picked up. She seemed relieved that I was finally participating in the arrangement properly instead of moping around about how uncomfortable everything made me feel. She had no idea that what was developing between Sarah and me was fundamentally different from her casual dating adventures. While my wife was collecting experiences and enjoying the thrill of variety, I was building something real with someone who actually wanted to build something back. Sarah wasn't interested in playing games or keeping things casual. She wanted to know about my life, my dreams, my fears, and my plans for the future in ways that my own wife hadn't bothered to ask in years. The speed at which genuine connection can develop when both people are actually invested became obvious within the first month. Sarah and I moved from casual dates to spending entire weekends together, talking about everything and nothing. She introduced me to her friends who welcomed me like I belonged there instead of treating me like some married guy they had to tolerate. Her enthusiasm for spending time with me was infectious and reminded me what it felt like to be genuinely wanted, rather than simply tolerated. The irony was perfect. While my wife was busy playing elaborate games with her manager who treated her like an entertaining distraction between meetings, I had stumbled into something authentic with someone who saw me as worth her time and attention. She was chasing workplace fantasy while I was experiencing real emotional intimacy for the first time in years. Her carefully orchestrated plan was succeeding in ways she never intended. Sarah's approach to our relationship highlighted everything that had been missing from my marriage. She would suggest activities we could do together and get excited about planning future adventures. She talked about introducing me to her family back home and asked about meeting mine. She treated our relationship like something worth investing in rather than something to be managed around other priorities.